Carol Bowman, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So you have two books, I see them right here. One is called Children's Past Lives. So can you tell us how you started on this journey?
Oh, it's a long time in coming. I had some experiences when I was young that made me realize that something within us doesn't die, but I didn't really know what to do with that information. And I had chronic lung problems in my mid-30s, and I was getting visions of what appeared to be another lifetime, which I couldn't understand. And shortly after that, I found that there was a hypnotherapist who did something called past life therapy. I didn't know what it was, but I thought maybe I'll try this to see if I can get some relief from these lung problems, which had not responded well to medical treatment. So after one 2-hour session, I saw 2 lives in which I died with trauma to the lungs, and they were very emotional experiences. And to my amazement, my lungs cleared up after that one session. So my medical doctor was very surprised, and he wanted to try regression too. So I invited the hypnotherapist, whose name was Norman Ing, to my home in Asheville to work with a number of my friends who were very interested in this. And this is back in '87. So around that time, we noticed that my son was terrified of loud booming sounds. And I couldn't understand what in his short life would create such a phobia. And I mentioned it to Norman, the hypnotherapist, when he was visiting us, thinking maybe he could give Chase, my son, some kind of post-hypnotic suggestion so the next time he was exposed to these loud booming sounds, he wouldn't be terrified. And I had no idea what was going to happen when Chase agreed that he wanted to do something about his fear. So Norman said to Chase, sit on your mom's lap. He was 5 years old at the time, so he fit on my lap. Sit on your mom's lap, close your eyes, and tell me what you see when you hear the loud sounds that frighten you. And I could see his eyelids fluttering, and he started describing something quite outside his range of experience. He said, I'm crouching behind a rock, I have a dirty uniform, and I have a long gun with a sword at the end. And I was shocked. I think I went into a mild state of shock at that point, trying to figure out what was going on. And went on to say he didn't know what he was doing in battle. There was smoke everywhere. He didn't even know who he was shooting at. And he said, I miss my wife and family. And that was the moment that it was an electric moment for me. You know, everything changed. I really think I was in shock. And Norman, who was very experienced in past life therapy, knew that Chase was accessing a past life memory at this point because he was describing things in battle, and he described how he was shot in his right wrist. They took him out of battle, and he said, they take me to this place. It's not like a regular hospital. He said they're just a tent with a bench, like a bed, and they put him on this bench bed. And they bandaged his wrist and told him he had to go back into battle. He said, I don't want to go. You know, there are other people, they're killing people. I don't want to kill other people. And Norman explained to Chase in very simple language a 5-year-old can understand. He said, we live many different lifetimes on Earth. In some lives we play different roles. And sometimes we're soldiers, and being a soldier, sometimes you have to kill others in battle, and sometimes you are killed, but there's no blame. And I could feel Chase's body relaxing on my lap. When Norman said that, something changed, something shifted. And a couple minutes later, he just jumped off my lap, grabbed a cookie, and went to play with his Legos. And I was thinking, what just happened? What just hit me? And he seems fine. And my daughter, who was 9 at the time, Sarah, was sitting with us. We were doing this around the kitchen table. And she said, "Mom, that place where Chase said he was shot on his wrist, that's where he has his eczema." And since Chase had been a baby, around 9 months old, he had this chronic severe eczema on his wrist, which had not responded to medical treatment. And within 2 or 3 days after this, probably 15-minute recollection of Chase's, his eczema cleared up completely, and his phobia went away. And he was just about to turn 6, and in fact, he asked for a drum kit for his 6th birthday so he could make loud booming sounds all the time. So after this experience, and my own experience healing, after physical healing and emotional healing after doing a regression, I was shocked that it worked so well with a 5-year-old, and I was wondering, do other kids have these memories too? It was so close to the surface. And I started asking other parents in my community, and some parents said, yeah, my daughter mentioned that she was a mother and she died in a flood and all her children died, and she was crying about it. And I was just finding a lot of small stories like Chase's, where the children remembered living before and they remembered their deaths, usually traumatic deaths. So that was the beginning of my research, and that was about 33 years ago. And I've been collecting cases and counseling parents ever since on how to help their own children if they start talking spontaneously about a past life memory.
So it seems with your son's case, you were more open to it because of your own experience. So can you tell us about your own healing?
Sure. Yeah, I think this was all orchestrated in exactly the right time, because when I did my first regression, I did believe that the soul is eternal, and I did believe that we have multiple lives, but I never really put it together. It wasn't something practical, it was just an abstract idea. So when I did my first regression, I went back to 2 lives I had had glimpses of in my waking visions and in dreams since childhood. In one, I saw that I died of consumption in the 19th century. I was a man, and I was a musician, and which explained my early interest in the piano, I think. And I died of consumption, which is illness in the lungs. And there were a lot of issues I saw in that life about not being able to have solid relationships because everyone wanted something from me. It was an interesting experience. And then in the same session, I saw a lifetime in which I died in World War II. I was a mother with 2 children, and I know I was living in Vienna. These things just came to me in the regression, almost like an intuitive knowing. And as the story progressed, I saw that it was during the time that the Nazis were in Austria, and my husband was taken away first, and I was left with my 2 children, and we were both, I never saw my husband again, and the children and I died in a concentration camp, and I knew that I had been gassed. And I saw my death, I saw myself below me in a pile of bodies. And it was a very emotional experience, remembering that. Although I had had traces of these memories since childhood, I had seen myself in dreams as that woman who died when I was young. But I never knew what it was. I thought, oh, maybe I'll be that woman when I grow up. I had no idea. And I had quite a catharsis. I cried a lot during that session. But afterwards, I felt very light. And within a few months, I realized that my lung problems had completely cleared up. And I had been suffering for at least 5 years with chronic lung problems. So that led to my doctor after wanting to do a regression and Norman returning to work with my friends because everyone was amazed at my recovery. So because I had an emotional healing from that and a physical healing with my lungs, when Chase had his experience, I understood the implications. You know, I understood that, yes, we can heal emotionally and even physically from recalling past lives. And as in my case, the traumatic deaths kind of sealed in the memories, kind of froze, like trauma in the current life. It acted as PTSD. So we can have trauma from the past that follows us from the past into our present lives. And that was a big revelation when I saw it with the children too. And as I did more research, I found the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia, who had documented about 2,500 cases of children who had spontaneous past life memories. And what I had found with my own experiences and in talking to other parents, he had found in thousands of cases that he investigated all over the world, primarily in India at the time. He had very few American cases. And one of the patterns that he saw is that children most often remember their deaths when they talk about past life memories, usually up until about the age of 5 or 7, and then the memories tend to fade. And this is universal across cultures and families where they believe in reincarnation and don't believe in reincarnation. So it's a natural phenomenon, and quite often children remembered how they died, and most of these deaths were traumatic. So again, that idea of PTSD traveling from one life to another showed up, and children would often have phobias relating to the way they died, which was the case with Chase. He had that phobia of loud booming sounds because the last thing he heard on the battlefield was a cannon, which he talked about later. So there was precedent for this research, but I noticed that a lot of American mothers needed help in guidance in talking to their children who seemed to be having a past life memory. So very early on in that process, I decided someday I'll write a book as a guide for parents so they can navigate this process on their own and help their own children process these past life memories, which is pretty simple to do, actually.
I want to get to that part, but first on the maybe reincarnation section, I think you mentioned Dr. Ian Stevenson has a lot of cases in India, and maybe that has something to do with the culture there. It seems they talk a lot more about reincarnation, and then the lack of American cases maybe. In the West, there's a lot of pushback against that. So how, you kind of mentioned in your early days you had your own ideas of reincarnation but didn't know what to do about that knowledge. So how did you get to that point of understanding?
Through my own regression work, it became something that moved from just an idea or a belief to reality, and a practical reality in my life. You know, that there was a reason why these memories were coming up. I had unfinished business from the past, and I think a lot of children do. And it's true that in India, for example, they had a lot more reported cases because it was a familiar concept. They took it for granted that, yes, we reincarnate. But there is a lot of pushback in the West, and I feel that my job has been to educate parents that this is a real phenomenon. It's a natural phenomenon. There's nothing wrong with their child. It's natural for children to remember up to a certain age. And if we can recognize these memories and talk a child through what happened before, phobias can go away, even physical symptoms, as in my son's case. So there are opportunities for healing within these memories. There's a reason why they're coming up. And I think it's because the soul wants to heal.
On the point of your son Chase, did he have a age where he started forgetting? Because I think you mentioned in the early years, 5 and up to 7, it's very easy for kids to remember past lives. Right. But did he start forgetting at some point?
He did. it's interesting because he also had an emotional healing. You know, he had a lot of guilt and confusion about having been a soldier. But after that session, he could let the memory go. He still had visual images of what happened. He remembered, you know, being above the battlefield. He remembered specific things about that battle. In fact, he knew what the battlefield looked like and was later recognized by a Civil War historian. So when he was about 8 years old, he said he was forgetting what happened and he wanted to record it. So he drew what he remembered. And I wish I had dated it because I don't remember the exact date, but he has retained visual memory still. He's 40 now. But the emotional memory left, you know, the painful memories left after he talked about it. So it was pretty immediate.
So it sounds like the emotional side is for the healing, and then once it's played that role, only the visuals remain. Is that fair?
If people have visuals, a lot of kids do, yeah. And for adults too. Except I think now that people can do past life therapy and have their sessions recorded, they have an aid in remembering, but you don't forget it. Once you, as an adult, you don't forget. But the children tend to forget as they move more into the real world around them around the age of 7.
And you also have a daughter, right? Did she also have experience with any past lives?
She did. She was terrified of our house burning down. And she had a little bag packed under her bed with her favorite doll, and she threw in a couple of clothes, items of clothing. And I didn't know she was terrified until she went to a friend's house to spend the night. I think she was 8 at that point. And I don't know why they watched a movie with a big fire and explosion in it, but she got triggered. As soon as she saw that in the movie, she was hysterical. And the mother, where she was staying, had to bring her home at about 11 o'clock that night because she was so distraught. So I didn't even know she had a phobia. And then she disclosed at that point that she had the bag packed under her bed because she was terrified that her house would burn down. And I tried to allay her fears by explaining we have, you know, here's how you exit the house. If we have a fire, it's not going to happen. We have fire extinguishers. And that didn't really help much. So when Norman came and worked with Chase, after she saw what happened with Chase, she wanted to do it too. So it was a very simple process. She was sitting at the kitchen table and Norman said to her, close your eyes and tell us what you see when you have that fear of fire. And she immediately went into this story about being a child living on a farm, and she was going to sleep and there was a house fire and she was upstairs and her parents weren't with her at that moment. They weren't in the room, and she tried to get out, but a fiery beam fell on her head, and that was the last thing she remembered. And she was above looking down at the scene. And she was very distraught. She was very emotional as she was remembering this. And she said, they really did try to save me. I believe that they hadn't. And this was her after death looking down, which in some of these cases is very interesting that children will remember that. They remember the out-of-body portion of the death experience. And she seemed, after she cried about that and realized that her parents had tried to save her, that had been an issue, she was fine. Her phobia went away. She didn't have any physical healing because there was nothing to be healed. But emotionally, she could unpack her bag at that point, literally, the bag under the bed. And, you know, it took 10 minutes for this whole process, and she was fine. So it was another case of a child having a phobia related to traumatic death.
And it seems in the cases with both your children and even yourself, you mentioned this like being above the scene and seeing it. So in that moment, do you or your kids remember, was it painful? What did that feel like, the almost seeing from above sense?
That's a good question. Actually, Sarah said that in an interview when she was a little older, she said if that's what death is like, it's not a scary process. It didn't hurt. You know, one minute she was in the body and going through this very frightening experience, and the next moment she was up above looking down so she could disengage. So she said if that's what death is like, it's not that bad. And I think that in some cases I've seen as an adult, as working with adults in past life therapy, they report that sometimes they, in a very traumatic situation, they will actually leave the body right before the death. So I think there is some protection, even though the body might be responding in a certain way. You know, it can be very scary, of course, and painful, but we're out. So I think that's kind of a positive way to look at things too. If it's really the case, it can allay a lot of fear about dying.
I want to zoom in on the healing part, because in your
Yeah.
book you mention Ian Stevenson's work and how he's documented all these cases, but he never really touched on the healing aspect. So how did you zone in on the healing part?
Because I experienced it and my kids did too, or Chase did too. So yeah, Ian Stevenson's work is amazing. And he was very thorough. He was an academic. He was also the head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. So he was very meticulous about documenting these cases and about his interview strategies, leaving very little room for skeptics. I was puzzled when I read a lot of Stevenson's cases that were massive cases that children remembered so much from the previous life. But I was surprised that he never mentioned healing, as I had experienced, as my son had experienced. And it just never was part of his case analysis. And I had a chance to meet him and actually follow him on some investigations of his cases. And I asked him, and he said, I don't know that it's possible. And I said, well, I found a lot of evidence that it is possible. And I realized in working with American cases, I'd never get the type of cases that he got in Asia, which were very detailed. I saw that his Asian cases were much more detailed. In cultures where they believe in reincarnation, the children remembered much more than they do in Western children. And there's something about the cultural beliefs or just the atmosphere is right where kids feel more comfortable talking about their past lives in cultures in which the parents are on board. So he was interested in verifying these cases. You know, if he could find who the child was in the past, if the child gave enough information, proper names of places and people, which they did, he could trace who the child had been. In a lot of cases, the child wanted to go back to the former home and see former relatives. So in his investigations, he would go with the family when they contacted the previous family, and quite often these cases could be verified that the child was remembering this other life that belonged to one specific person who died in the way the child described. So he had I think about 900 cases were verified by the time of his death. But he didn't want to go into the healing aspects of these memories. And I was finding that that was happening with some of the cases in which I counseled the parents on how to talk the child through the past life trauma. So I realized, because I had that experience and Chase had that experience, we were familiar with that, and the potential was there, so I decided that's where my focus needed to be, to educate parents about these memories, how to identify them, but also how to talk them through that process. So if they had troubling memories from the past, and not all children do. Some children have very positive, benign memories, but they're less likely to be credited to being past life memories. You know, oh, that's interesting. That's a nice story that they're telling. But when a child starts talking about the death, I think that alerts the parents that there's something more going on here. So there are ways to talk the child through that traumatic death so they can let go. And that's the point, that they can heal emotionally, physically, and let go of the past and don't need to hold onto that lifetime or trauma.
And how do you talk to parents who might be skeptical or afraid it might hurt their kid to go through this type of regression?
Well, they don't go through regression. The parents help them process it just by talking them through. There's nothing, no hypnosis, nothing. It's just talking to the child as the memory's coming up. What they need to know is that sometimes a child just has to talk it through and just be a good listener and ask them how they feel, what happens to them, and just go along with them, guide them through the story. And different children respond differently to these techniques, but I've found that in some cases a child can have an instantaneous healing of past life issues by just talking it through for a few minutes. In some cases it's more complicated, and I get into that in the books because there are things you can say. You can ask them, you know, go through the death, how did you die? And then what happened to you? And some kids report being in this afterlife state, as my kids did, where they were still conscious, but they were a little bit removed from the situation. And a lot of kids will say, oh, and then I came back and I'm now in a new body, you know, and they're very delighted to know that. And that's one of the things that parents can tell their child, that, you know, that was before, you're now safe, or give them whatever assurances they need, and you're safe in a new body. And that comes as a big surprise to some of these kids because they're still on this continuum of consciousness where they don't know the difference between something that happened in their prior life. They perceive it as something that just happened to them. They're still on this time continuum when they're young. So you have to help them realize that they have moved on. And it's very simple, use very simple language, and it can work wonders.
And in the cases you've experienced or worked with, have, you know, people been in different cultures, different races?
That's part of the mechanics of this. We change location, not necessarily though. We can also be born back into the same family, which we can talk about in a moment. But we can change culture, religion, gender. You know, we experience different things over millennia. You know, I don't know what the average is of how many lifetimes we have. I think it varies from soul to soul. But we have many different experiences, and hopefully it will give us some degree of acceptance of others, knowing that we've had lives in other culture, other skin color, and, you know, everything. So we are universal beings in that sense. And I know it's made me more aware of what's the same in people rather than what's different.
And on the point of, say, returning to the same family, I think in your Children's Past Lives book, you talk about your own kids and how they were acting out different lifetimes throughout. So can you tell us about that part?
Ooh. My children remembered several lifetimes in which they were together before, and it was interesting because there were some common themes, and it seemed like they were battling over inheritance in different ways. Where if they were a female, they were cut out of the inheritance. If they were a male, they were reinstated as the heir to whatever they had, the land or the money, the riches. It was really interesting that they had this dynamic between them that finally resolved when they talked about it together, and they had a little bit of a cry together. So it was very emotional for them to realize that, but they also are very close now and have been. You know, it's not the usual sibling rivalry as it once was when they were little. There were some things that came up, as do often with kids. But they had something they needed to work out with each other, and they had a chance to do it when they were young. And that's unusual. And, you know, that I had two kids who could remember, but I think that was all planned out for me because this is my life's work. But it can happen that siblings, both siblings, can have past life memories and they can recognize each other. And as I got more deeply into the research, I was getting these cases of parents who were calling me saying, okay, this might sound weird, but I think my father has been reborn as my daughter, or my brother who died in a car accident is back as my son. And I found that this is very common, and Dr. Stevenson talked a lot about we call them same family cases. And I was getting so many cases that I wrote a book just on that phenomenon. And some of the cases are so compelling. It's amazing what kind of detail the children remember from their former lives. And in the same family cases, the surviving family members knew the deceased well, so they can recognize these similar traits or affinities or talents that the prior personality had. And I have this one case of a little girl in California who turned out to be the reincarnation of her great-grandmother. And the great-grandmother was a performer. She liked to sing and dance and use makeup. And in fact, she was a dance instructor. This little girl, when she was about 2.5, I believe, was sitting in the car with her mother and great-grandmother. And she started singing a song that was popular in the 1940s, Chattanooga Choo Choo, in all its verses. And the mother had to pull over the side of the road because that was her mother's favorite song to sing. And there was no way in the world that this child could have picked that up because it's never on the radio. And she knew all the verses. Her mother didn't even know all the verses. And that was just one indication that her grandmother was back as her daughter. And this little girl went for her first dance lesson, and I think she was like 4 when she went for the first lesson, and the dance teacher asked the mother, well, did she where did she study dance before? And her mother said, no, she just knows how to do this. And so there was some kind of precocious ability that was carried over from the previous life, and it happens in quite a number of cases. But it was this song, that just threw her mother into shock. How could she know this? But a lot carries over. It's not only knowing things, it's, sometimes physicality, unlearned abilities, or what we call genius or precociousness, sometimes just carry over from the past. And I think it's a logical explanation for child prodigies.
And in the cases, from what you've seen, what is the reason that people come back to the same life? Because I think in your own children's case, your daughter mentioned, I chose to follow, like your son, into this life. So what other cases have you seen for the reason why maybe people end up in the same family?
Oh, well, one reason is a premature death. I think the seminal case in the second book is of a little boy from the Chicago area who developed neuroblastoma, which expressed itself as tumors, brain tumors, but tumors all over his body, behind his left eye, tumors in one leg, like 16 tumors in one leg. And the mother was a single mom, and she raised this little boy, and at one point he had been hospitalized when they discovered he had neuroblastoma, and they tried different procedures and nothing worked. So they told her she had to take her son home, that he was going to die, and it was horrible. He was 24 months old when he died. 13 years later, she gave birth to what would have been her fourth child. When she was in the delivery room after having a C-section, the doctors came in and said, "We have to tell you there's something wrong with your son." And after losing a child, she immediately thought, oh, he's going to die. But they brought him in. They said he was blind in his left eye. It looked opaque. He had what looked like a scar on his neck as a birthmark. He had a birthmark on his neck at the same site where the other child had had an IV inserted in the hospital, which left a scar. And he had facial distortion on one side of his face, as the other child had had. So because of the physical similarities with the tumor behind his left eye that caused blindness, she immediately put it together, like, how can this be? But I think this is the same child. And when she had her other children, it never occurred to her that one of them could be the reincarnation of the son she lost. But this was very clear that there was physical carryover. And she, at first, didn't want to believe it. And because of her background, they're very religious Christians. It was very awkward to talk about it with family. She couldn't. And she was holding all this information in. She didn't want people to think she was crazy in her family. At age 4, he started talking about his other life. He described the apartment that she had lived in with her first son, described the furniture in the apartment, and asked for toys that the other child had owned that they didn't have with this child. So he started remembering, and she didn't know what to do, and it was right after my first book came out. So a friend of hers contacted me for her. This is before the internet. And we talked on the phone, and I assured her that this is possible and that this child should be okay. It doesn't mean he's going to die as the other one did. And I talked her through this process for over a year, and she made peace with it, and she said it helped her so much to realize this. And she said she didn't need to go to the cemetery all the time. She really felt at peace for the first time. It had been 13 years between the time that the first child born and the second one was, reborn. So it helped her grieving process. And to me, it's a miracle. And she described it as a miracle, too. She had no idea this was even possible. And I've had other cases in the book of children who die prematurely in accidents or through illness who come back to the same mother. Even within a shorter span of time, it could be just a few years. So I thought that this was really important information that should be disseminated through a book. People need to know this is possible. When you lose a child, they can come back. The difficult part is if they believe that and it doesn't happen, they could be disappointed. But there is that possibility, and I want people to be open to that it can be any configuration too. It could be a grandfather coming back as a child or a sibling, it doesn't matter. And even I have a couple of cases where there's someone very close to the family who died prematurely, who came back because just as this bond of friendship. And I talked to Ian Stevenson about that since he documented a number of those same family cases. And I said, what do you think brings people back into the same feeling? I asked him, what do you think brings souls back into the same family? And he looked at me and he said, isn't love enough? It wasn't the answer I was expecting, but there is a pull. You know, and I think if there's unfinished business, if there's premature death, it can bring a soul back into the same family to finish or just to be with the family to give them peace.
So in this example, you mentioned the birthmark that related to the previous life. So how often do you find birthmarks point to a previous life, and what can we learn from them?
That's a little tricky because there's some birthmarks that are just birthmarks, but Ian Stevenson wrote a 2,200-page tome called Reincarnation and Biology, which are his studies of birthmarks related to traumatic, usually the injuries right before death. So there's a precedent in his research. And, you know, in other cultures, sometimes they recognize someone who's reborn through birthmarks, and they can be quite striking. But it's tricky with birthmarks because some can relate to a previous death or fatal wound or injury, and others are just birthmarks. So it's hard to say, you know, what percentage of children or adults have birthmarks relating to previous lives, but it is possible. And even in Chase's case, that eczema he had on his wrist, where he had been shot, is in the same category. You know, it's a physical manifestation of a past life wound or injury. And in my case, it came as chronic lung problems. And I'm sure, well, actually I've seen that I've had quite a few lifetimes in which I died where I couldn't breathe. So I carried that, the pattern just deepened, and I carried that into this life. So it can show up as illness too.
Oh, so in one of the stories you told, especially of the little boy coming back, you mentioned the mother was very religious and had a lot of difficulty talking to her own family about it. So what would be your advice to people who are facing that, and why is there that barrier?
Well, because in our culture, we just don't believe in reincarnation. It goes against religious teachings and the Judeo-Christian culture, although there is the belief in Judaism going back to the Kabbalah and the Zohar. And early Christians believed in reincarnation too, the Essenes. So there is precedent, but it was taken out of the teachings. So that's a huge impediment to people recognizing this or accepting that this is what's happening. And there's a lot of criticism or skepticism from relatives, or, you know, this is of the devil. I mean, it gets pretty harsh in the criticism. And, you know, I worked with one mother, and she went to her pastor who said, you know, there's something wrong with you, and you can't believe this because it's of the devil. So when you have that kind of pushback, a lot of people are very susceptible to that. You know, they are afraid to talk about it. They don't want to be excommunicated from the church or ostracized for their beliefs. And it's a cultural thing, basically, and a religion.
I think in your own book, Children's Past Lives, you mentioned kind of your own journey where you were reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and then it had a lot of things you could relate to, but at the same time, there was a bit of that cultural barrier. And it wasn't until you were in college and reading poets like Blake that you kind of bridged that. So how did that bridge happen? What was the similarities that were able to blend the East and the West for you?
Well, I had this experience on a beach. I was on sunrise on the beach, and just something hit me where I knew that we were all energy, and a part of us doesn't die. There's no such thing as death. And it was a very profound moment, accompanied by some lightning in a clear sky. So it was very dramatic. But I felt like this is real. You know, I knew it was real. And, you know, so this happened in 1970. And, you know, over the years, there are people exploring consciousness, and Raymond Moody with his research of near-death experiences where people are still conscious after death. That was a great find for me when I read his work, because there's a lot of similarities between what happens after death and ancient texts like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I'm not that familiar with Hindu scripture, but in the Upanishads they talk about rebirth, and it's as natural as any natural cycle.
Earlier, it seems there was some pushback in some of the religious communities, but in your work and throughout the years, what has the response from the scientific community been?
They don't bother me. I don't present myself as a scientist. I guess they're called a citizen scientist. I think they just write me off as some crazy person. But there's Ian Stevenson's solid research. And more people are discovering this. There are now Facebook pages and my website, that's the Reincarnation Forum, that's been going since 1997. And there are a lot of cases out there. And for anyone who's open-minded, the evidence is in the cases. You know, give me another explanation that fits. That's as good as reincarnation. There's something about consciousness surviving death, and even more than that, that this consciousness carries some kind of memory or coding or a template that informs our present lives. So since I don't present myself as a scientist, I don't have to worry about it.
In your own research, it seems a lot of it comes down to being open-minded to new ideas, new understanding. So how do you see that open-mindedness playing a role in maybe uniting people in this day and age?
I think that being open to this concept of reincarnation or having experiences oneself makes you realize that we've all been male, female, different cultures, different skin color, different religions, and I think it's more difficult to be prejudiced once we realize that, and I think it can make us more compassionate. I see in my son's case, he was born in this incarnation as a white-skinned redhead. When he saw that he was a black soldier, he didn't think anything of it. In fact, in another interview, someone asked him about that, and he was like, huh? Like, is that an issue? He doesn't see that in this life. You know, he's very open. I think it can expand your awareness of other people, what they're going through, and maybe give us more empathy. You know, if we remember having been a slave or dying because of one's religion or all the other injustices in the world, I think this is helpful to realize this isn't the only shot we have. You know, this is just one life of many. And we're here to do specific things in each lifetime, you know, if we're lucky enough to figure that out. So I think it can be very helpful to have this context for other lifetimes. Will it change humanity? I hope so, but who knows? I don't know. You know, it's such a big question, and everything is so polarized now. But I think there's hope in this belief, and there's a sense of if we need to atone for anything, we have an opportunity. If we die conflicted, we can come back and make things right or finish. So I think it's a very hopeful way of seeing things.
Watch new episodes every Saturday on NTD television at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and on Epic TV at 9:15 p.m.